Today we're playing a game called Overwhelm, an action horror world where enemies get power-ups and you don't. This game is quite the ride, and along the way I got to thinking about how side-scrolling horror can be designed. So, if you want to make your own 2D side-scrolling horror game, you've come to the right place. I'm getting spooked out just thinking about this episode, so let's jump right in. Overwhelm is a side-scrolling shooter where you play as a gun-toting knight sent to destroy a menacing race of monsters called the Hive. As soon as you start, it's clear that this game isn't messing around. You learn the controls, jump down a hole, and get your main objective, retrieve 5 crystals and bring them back to this central room. But doing so will not be easy. Not only do you have limited ammo, but the enemies kill you in one hit. On top of that, you have 3 lives, and when they all run out, you've got to start the game over. To even the odds a little bit, if you've killed a boss, you can restart at its chamber to skip over some traveling. Nevertheless, this is a hard game. But the real question is it scary? But I'd say the real question is, can a 2D side-scroller even be scary? When we look to the most well-known horror games, we see mostly 3D titles. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Outlast, Amnesia, these are all major staples of the horror genre. But where's the love for side-scrollers? A quick Google search would make you think that there were no 2D horror games. The indie scene has explored this genre a bit more than the AAAs, but there's still not much here. Side-scrolling horror is a mostly untapped genre, and I think I know the reason. 3-dimensional games allow for better immersion, or so you might think. In 3D, you can hide things in separate rooms, around corners, under beds, and especially behind the player character. If you're working in first person, this effect works even better, because there's no visible character acting as a barrier between the player and the scares. If you move to 2D, you lose these things. There's no hiding things in separate rooms because you can see in every room. There's no sneaking up behind the player because you can just see behind the player. And obviously first person is no longer possible. So 3D, at first glance, just seems like the better option when creating a horror game. However, I believe that when one door closes, another opens. Sure, you lose some options when moving to 2D, but I think it also opens up a lot of interesting ways to create a horror experience, some of which couldn't be done in 3D. For example, in 2D, escape is harder to achieve. You don't have the same freedom of movement as a 3D game would provide. In 3D, if something's coming at you, you technically have a lot of different directions to run in to escape it, granted the level design provides it. In 2D, you're working with way less directions. If something is coming at you from the right, you have to go left, end of story. You also can't look away from what's scaring you. In a first-person game, as soon as you turn to run, you can't see the monster anymore. But in 2D, you have to watch yourself get chased by whatever you're running from. You're constantly aware of how close it is to getting you, and you're constantly aware of how scary looking it is. You see, in my opinion, I don't think it matters what dimension you choose to work in, and that's because the things that make horror games scary aren't dimension-specific. What I'm gonna do today is go over what I believe are the 3 pillars of horror game design and talk about how they pertain to 2D games. Because games like Overwhelm prove that it's possible to scare your players just as much as 3D without using that third D. Let's start with our first pillar, tension. If I had to choose one word to sum up Overwhelm, it would be tense. About 99% of my time playing this game was spent being wicked stressed out. To understand Overwhelm's cycle of tension, let's break down its gameplay loop. As I said earlier, your goal in this game is to retrieve 5 crystals and bring them back to this main room. You embark on the hunt for a crystal of your choice. You can get them in any order. Each crystal is guarded by a boss. Your main goal here is to make it to the boss with all of your lives and as much ammo as possible. So with every bullet you spend, your stress level rises slightly. The next phase of this loop is the boss fight. The bosses in this game are intense. Most of them rely on melee attacks, which means they're constantly chasing you around the room, trying to eat you or strangle you or do some weird hentai tentacle shit to you. It gets scary fast. The fact that you can only take one hit really sells these fights. You cannot make any mistakes. If you manage to escape getting your asshole fisted and actually win, the next phase begins. The crystal emerges from the boss, and it's now your job to take it back to the hub room. This is where Overwhelm's main mechanic comes into play. The enemies receive the boss's ability. So after you beat the twin lizards, the enemies are able to climb on walls. And after you kill the big bird, the flying enemies now fly much faster and make a terrifying buzzing sound. The good news is you get your 3 lives back. The bad news is you don't get your ammo back. So now you have to make it back to the hub with limited ammo while being hunted by a horde of newly upgraded enemies. The stakes are pretty high. Here's a graph to show how Overwhelm cranks up the tension as you go through this loop. Getting to the crystal is the least scary part. This is when you've still got all your lives and ammo and you don't really have anything to lose. Then comes the boss fight. The difficulty of these fights, combined with the reality of only having 3 tries at the most, makes for a frightening experience. The final phase, getting back to the hub, is the climax, the moment of truth. You either make it back and refill your lives and ammo, or you fail and have to start over. This is scary, but not in the traditional sense. You're not scared of the enemies because of how they look, you're scared of them because of what they're capable of. One touch and you might be starting your whole run over. That boss you just worked so hard to beat will come right back to life. Like I said before, it's tension, not visuals, at the root of Overwhelm's horror. Overwhelm isn't the only game to use tension as its main source of horror. A similar thing goes on throughout the entirety of Metroid Fusion. In this game, Samus goes from being the hunter to the hunted, as you are constantly stalked by the SAX, a shadowy clone created from your DNA. At specific moments throughout your mission, she'll appear searching for you. Back in the day on the Game Boy Advance, this was a real pants-shitting moment. This game handles its tension a bit differently than Overwhelm. Fusion leans more towards themes of mystery, whereas Overwhelm is a lot more in-your-face stressful. In Overwhelm, you know exactly what you're afraid of, starting over from scratch. In Fusion, you don't always know what you're afraid of. Take this part with the boss Nightmare. In Sector 5, when you reach this room with these glass walls, a huge shadow moves across the wall outside, followed by this unsettling roar. This is sure to stick with you, because where there's a monster, there's surely going to be a fight with it. But you can't even see what this thing is, and you've been given no prior knowledge that there would be anything in here. Later on, in a different area, your computer companion tells you that there's been a breach in Sector 5. Uh-oh, this is the place where you saw that huge shadow. You go back to the same room and the glass has been broken. This thing that you saw is loose. You have no idea when and where you're going to run into it, and you don't even know what it is. Other areas of the sector have been destroyed, making it clear that this monster is strong and dangerous. And then, the climax, the moment of truth. You drop down into this room and it appears. This creepy, mask-wearing, long-armed, floating weapon system that distorts gravity and oozes green goo. During the fight, his mask breaks and his face is awful. It's all melty and drippy and icky and sticky. This was definitely worth the lead-up. Let's look again at the steps in this tension-building process. See creepy thing, get bad news, see evidence of why you should be afraid, and in danger. Before we move on, I have to give credit to this video by the channel Video Game Animation Study. This video taught me a lot about how Fusion creates fear, and it inspired a lot of what I've said on the game thus far. I definitely recommend checking this video out if you're a Metroid Fusion fan. Tension can be a super effective tool in the horror game designer's toolbox, and as we've seen, your game doesn't have to be 3D for this trick to work. Overwhelm and Metroid Fusion both build up tension to create two very unique experiences. While the former is very stressful and on edge, the latter is more mysterious and foreboding. Tension is something that works just as well in 2D as it does in 3D, making it a reliable source of horror for your own games. Let's move on to our second pillar of horror, discomfort. The best way for me to explain this pillar is to tell the story of the time my brother and I played Axiom Verge. This is a 2D Metroidvania set in an alien world filled with strange landscapes, giant robots, and grotesque monsters. The whole game is pretty unsettling, mostly just because of how weird everything is. One minute you're in a cave made of organic red goo, and the next you're outside among these huge, spiky balls. The main character, Trace, doesn't have any more of an idea about what's going on than you do. But there's one scene in Axiom Verge that stands out from the rest. It starts when you enter Yukin Na, an underground area with waterfalls. Upon entering the area, you move through a couple rooms, and then this happens. You see yourself run through a door. Naturally, you give chase, and a few moments later, you see this person again. This is obviously a strange sight, but what makes this even more unsettling is that your robotic companion, Elsa Nova, doesn't see the man, only you do. Then you walk into this connecting hallway, and you notice that everything looks to be swaying. Trace comments that it seems to be getting hotter. You continue on, and he makes another remark about how he's starting to not feel well. Elsa Nova claims she knows the reason. It's that you've been infected with an enemy pathogen. Trace then calls Elsa Nova by the villain's name by accident. Now we add another factor of discomfort. You're suddenly aware that there's something wrong with you. Before, when Elsa Nova said she hadn't seen your clone, we thought she was the weird one, or perhaps that she was lying. Now it's becoming clear that maybe she didn't see it, because it wasn't there. Now things start to get truly disturbing. There are faces on the wall that move, Trace has a conversation with a talking head, the walls start to sway more and more, everything is glowing red, and we start to be attacked by enemies we've never seen before, including, you guessed it, seamen. Some of these enemies don't even make sense in the game world. Trace is supposed to be the only human in this alien realm, and yet there seem to be people walking around in white robes. All the while, this really trippy music just loops over and over again. Everything culminates when you reach the boss chamber. You step into the room and a flying alien appears. Trace's text box shows up, but something's wrong. His face is all weird. And the normal Trace starts speaking the same way the other bosses do. When the fight starts, you realize it's the flying alien that you're now controlling, and the normal Trace is who you're fighting. This fight is scripted though, it's not possible to win, and once you're killed, a cutscene ensues in which you learn that it was all indeed a hallucination. This is my favorite scene in the game. It really creeped me out on my first playthrough, and I was sitting there in broad daylight playing it with my brother. I can only imagine how terrified I would have been playing through this segment at night, home alone. My point with this story is that disturbing content is not limited to 3D whatsoever, meaning that if you make good use of it, you can scare the shit out of people in just 2 dimensions. Sure, discomfort can be created through hyper-realistic gore and detail, but it can also be achieved by doing stuff that throws the player off mentally. Things like movement where there shouldn't be, faces on the walls, strange colors, grabby boys, and a surprise visit from the clan definitely do the trick. But what really sells this scene is that you can't trust the player character. Once you find out that none of this is real, you start wondering where the hallucination ends and where reality begins. Just how much of what you're seeing is Trace's imagination. When it comes to horror games, everything is out to get you, but one thing is usually clear: you and the player character are on the same page. You most likely feel the same way about the situation you're in, and you've been given the same amount of information. So as soon as you're not on the same page, as soon as you have to start questioning if what's happening is real, you start to feel a great sense of discomfort. Like you're just floating out in this horrifying experience where there are no certainties. Having your character hallucinate isn't the only way to create discomfort in your game. As I said before, discomfort often comes from the unexpected. When things don't act the way we expect them to, we become confused and start to feel ungrounded. Another 2D game that handles discomfort well is Pac-Man.exe, a Pac-Man browser game on itch.io that sees Pac-Man remade as a horror game. In this version, you can only see down the hallways that you're in line with, meaning that the ghosts aren't always in sight. And speaking of the ghosts, they're a lot more menacing than their original counterparts. The red one rushes you, the orange one teleports, and the gray one moves through walls. Sometimes when you get caught, the game zooms in and creates a kind of jump scare moment. But other times, nothing. Just silence, and then the game restarts. I found this to be scarier, because I was always waiting for something to happen, and nothing did. I was just staring into the empty eyes of the characters, waiting for a jump scare that wouldn't come. The UI is also disturbing. Again, this brings us back to that whole movement where it doesn't belong thing. Going back to Overwhelm, this game creates discomfort by having a quivering vignette close in on the player with every life you lose. This effect actually covers your UI and hides how much ammo you have, which adds a layer of, you guessed it, confusion. Overwhelm's art style adds a factor of discomfort as well. The color red is known to increase your heart rate and incite feelings of excitement or anger. You might find yourself feeling more awake or on edge playing this game without even realizing it. While tension is a very conscious feeling, discomfort is achieved on a more subconscious level. The former is something that uses stress and anxiety to put you on the edge of your seat, while the latter uses disturbance to make you feel like something is just off. Discomfort tends to attack the background of your thoughts, putting you off center and making you worry for reasons you can't put your finger on. So far, we've focused solely on visual aspects of horror, but the auditory factor makes just as much of an impact. That's why the third pillar of the horror genre is sound design. When it comes to horror games, music and sound effects play a gigantic role, and these things obviously aren't 3D specific. Here's some math for you. I'd estimate that sound design makes up for about 50% of the scare factor in your game. Since the dimension you choose to work in only affects your visuals, that means that half your scare factor will be there regardless of whether your game is 2D or 3D. When used correctly, sound effects and music can be the difference between a lackluster moment and a horrifying one. Overwhelm makes great use of music and sound. When you start your adventure, you're accompanied by this ominous music. But as soon as you jump into the hive, everything goes silent. The hub room makes some light noise, but once you're out in other areas, you're accompanied only by strange environmental sound. Some places make the whirring noises of machines. This area has the sound of wind and tall grass. And some rooms are just silent. This lack of music not only makes everything scarier and lonelier, it also allows you to hear the sounds of the enemies. The birds flap their wings, the crawling ones make a distinct jumping sound, and the shielded ones roar. There are some really scary moments where you'll hear an enemy before you see it, and then start swinging your gun around as you frantically search for it. And I can't mention Overwhelm's sound design without talking about this screeching sound that plays during your last life. It makes an already tense, all-or-nothing moment even more stressful. Lower-pitched sounds are used to build tension and dread, while higher-pitched ones induce panic and discomfort. Think of low-pitched as potential energy and high-pitched as kinetic. When you're leading up to a scary moment, you can use low frequencies to build up tension, like pulling on a rubber band. You build it up more and more, and then bam, the scare comes. This is usually where higher frequencies are used to release that potential energy, like letting the rubber band snap. We can see this method a lot in Metroid Fusion as well. Low strings are used during foreboding story segments, and higher pitched music kicks in during boss encounters. Axiom Verge has low, droning noises when you approach a boss chamber, and a high siren when you enter it. All in all, sound design is pivotal in every horror game, but in just 2 dimensions, it's even more important to really sell your scares with strategically placed music and sound. Because 2D graphics are typically less detailed than 3D, you can make up for low-detailed visuals with intricately detailed sound design. Tension, discomfort, and sound design. These are the 3 pillars of a successful horror game. And as we've seen, there are plenty of 2-dimensional games that achieve a scary atmosphere by making use of these 3 principles. Overwhelm is certainly one of them. I really enjoyed my time with this one. If you like roguelikes, stress, and the color red, I definitely recommend it. Before we put this episode to rest, let's wrap up what we've learned today. Tension can be created by putting your player in high-consequence situations. Overwhelm does this by making you start the whole game over if you lose your 3 lives. Tension can also be created by leading the player on a trail of rising fear, as we saw in Metroid Fusion. Discomfort is primarily created by doing things that are unexpected. And by unexpected, I don't mean jump scares, I mean things that don't make sense or just seem off. Good sound design is all about knowing when to stay quiet and when to get loud. Silence can be a very powerful weapon, but frantic music and high-pitched noise definitely have their places too. Remember the whole potential and kinetic energy thing. It's really effective when leading up to a scare. And most importantly, remember what I said in the beginning. The things that make horror games scary aren't dimension specific. We've looked at a bunch of 2D games today that all accomplish feelings of dread, disturbance, and downright fear. Remember these 3 pillars, and you'll be ready to go out there and raise some 2-dimensional hell all on your own. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something today about horror game design, and if you're working on your own 2D horror game, send it to me. I'd love to check it out. I know I said my episode about Space Cortex was going to come out before this one, but I was having some technical difficulties recording that game, so that episode will be coming out at a later date. Now, some of you guys may have noticed my new Hybrid Plays sweatshirt. That's right, this is the first official piece of Hybrid Plays merch. You guys may have also noticed the shirt that I was wearing in the last episode. These were both gifts from my girlfriend. She's been absolutely amazing and incredibly supportive when it comes to the channel, and this stuff just blew me away. I'm thinking about printing more of these shirts and making them available to the public, so if that's something you guys are interested in, please comment below. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to my amazing Patreon supporters who help make this channel possible. You guys are the best. That's all from me today, so I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see y'all next time. Take care.
This is gonna be after the video's over footage.
Okay.
Wait, can you do that again?